reviewing the scientific literature to answer your questions about gender diversity. This is Classroom Psychology. And now here's your host, Dr. Cora Sargent. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Classroom Psychology. I'm your host, Cora. Thank you so very much, as always, for jumping on in here. Hey, it's wonderful to see you. Hey, have you done something with your hair? It's great to see you. You look amazing. Hey, let's learn about gender diversity some more. And this week, much like we do every time we come together as a little community, we take a question from a public figure or book author, or in this case, a podcast host, and maybe the director of a charity, and we take their often confidently declared statements for the questions that we're sure they're intended to be, and we see if we can't take a look at the scientific literature to see if we can't find a scientific consensus around an answer together. This week we have two question askers. Our first is Charlie Kirk, who is the founder and executive director of Turning Point USA. He's also a right-wing political activist, radio talk show host, and internet personality. And he is taken to talking, he talks about right-wing issues pretty heavily, generally speaking, but talking about gender diversity. So this is Charlie Kirk.
What does being trans even mean? Is that even a real thing? It means you need therapy. And I have compassion for you. Some people say, oh, Charlie, it's too mean-spirited, all of this. Hold on a second. Time out. You know what's mean-spirited? Erasing womanhood. Acting as if XX chromosomes mean nothing and some freak with XY chromosomes can suddenly become a woman.
Thanks so much to Charlie Kirk for such an interesting question posed, as they often are, pretty directly, in the form of some confident declaration. Is it possible for me to cringe audibly? Let me try. Okay, so let's listen. So what is trans? What is trans? What is trans? How do we define it? There's a legitimate question in here. I'm sure we can find it. What is trans, and what does it mean to be trans? But there's also another question in here, I think, that's connected to something that Stephanie Davies-Arai said. She is the founder of and the director of Transgender Trend, which is, they describe themselves as the leading UK organisation calling for evidence-based healthcare for gender diverse folk, particularly children and young people. You can tell in the title, like Transgender Trend, they just see gender diversity as a trend rather than a truth of reality. But Stephanie Davies-Arai did on an interview make the following statement, which I think is kind of useful, maybe something we could tackle. So here is Stephanie Davies-Arai.
This organisation, Global Butterflies, they've been saying to the staff that apparently there are now 150 ways to express gender that they need to think about as they look after their patients, the children in schools. Sorry, not in school, in the hospital.
This is another example of the obfuscation of language, isn't it? There are lots of ways to express yourself. There are billions of ways to express yourself. What they're talking about is gender identity, and that's the new religion that they preach. They're another group who are, like Stonewall, teaching gender identity, this concept that we all have an innate sense of being male or female, which is completely separate from our biology, completely separate from any kind of socialization we've experienced as girls or boys, and that's the criteria that makes us a man or a woman or a boy or a girl, and not our biological sex. So that's what they preach as fact.
Thanks so much for Stephanie Davies-Arai for such an interesting question, posed as they often are in the form of confident declaration, claiming that that this is a new religion, that gender identity is a new religion, and that it doesn't have a clear definition. And I would say that she's not wrong in that it doesn't have a clear definition. And so let's have a look today and see if we can't define it. Especially since, central government, we got people in parliament talking about the idea that because you can't define gender identity, you can't protect it in law, which is kind of weird to me. Let's try and define it. So let's take a look. What is trans and what is gender identity? Let's take a look. So, I mean, the first thing we need to understand here is that the reason why these terms are necessary, right? Why do we need to think about trans? Why do we need to think about gender identity as concepts at all? And the reason is because of the way in which we operationalize gender on a day-to-day basis in society, right? So Lindqvist and colleagues in 2021, they released a really cool paper, What is Gender Anyway? A review of the options for operationalizing gender. So if you're a scientist in any field, but you are interested in considering how do we operationalize gender in our science and maybe call into question the dominant ways of operationalizing gender, because basically what Lindqvist says is that, listen, what we generally do is you operationalize gender, male and female. Those are the boxes that we have. Man or woman, male and female in a binary system. We invite people to categorize themselves into a binary system almost habitually. We do it in all kinds of places. And in earnesty, we create the context in which we find gender differences where maybe gender differences aren't particularly relevant, because just by the virtue of the way in which we have categorized gender in the research that we conduct. So we have this kind of very typical way of doing things. We have male stroke female as the dichotomy, or man stroke woman, and we invite and we do things like we categorize them in the analysis in this way, even if we're not necessarily expecting gender differences. It's very common to just kind of split the analysis on the basis of gender, on this binary categorization of gender. And then sometimes people will find gender differences because of the categorization that we have done, because we split the data, even if we weren't expecting to find them. We then take for granted that those sex differences are real, right? Because of course, we tend to think of sex differences as real things, and therefore we split data based on gender, even if we're not expecting sex differences. And then if we happen to find something, we then claim that we found some kind of sex difference. And so basically, Lindqvist and colleagues are saying, well, why do we do this? Like, why do we separate gender in this way? Is this a good way to do things? And they say, well, no. And moreover, they say that this is a discriminatory ideology because it inherently delegitimizes individuals who have a self-designated gender that's different to the one that is basically called for in the research. So I came across a study recently. It was actually an MS study. And I'd been asked, like, oh, hey, I'm not personally, but somebody had sent it to me saying, oh, yeah, these people are looking for participants in a research study. And I was like, oh, I'll jump on in. I've got MS. and I know how difficult it is to populate research. I'm in. And they said, the only question about gender they had was, what is your sex assigned at birth, or something like that? What is your sex at birth? And I was like, well, I kind of get why they're asking the question, right? I do understand the need for a question like that. I understand it. But at the same time, it is inherently discriminatory, because if you're not also asking about somebody's gender, then you're just inviting them to misgender themselves throughout the research, right? Like, sure, I might have been male at birth, but to think of me as a boy in all ways and means here is probably not going to be good for your research, right? Because I don't know if you noticed, I ain't a boy in all ways and means, right? Like, I ain't a typical dude. I ain't a dude at all. So, to put me in just the male box, it seems like it's not going to do your study any favors. And of course, it's as though there are two genders in the world anyway. We know that gender binary, the gender binary is discriminatory inherently, right? We know that non-binary communities exist. We know that gender fluid communities exist. We know that there are a bunch of genders that fall between and outside of the binary that people experience themselves to be. And so Lindqvist and colleagues are saying, what we are doing here is what we would describe as cis normativity, right? The idea that sex and gender are aligned, and that we privilege that alignment in the way that we conduct business, right? Where we basically inherently validate that alignment, and we inherently invalidate anybody that doesn't experience that alignment for one reason or another, right? And it also, they say, includes the underlying assumption that all women have bodily attributes associated with the female sex, such as, forgive me for the explicit language, such as a vagina, while all men are presumed to have bodily attributes associated with a male sex, such as a penis. Right? Now, we know that that isn't always the case, right? We've spent 23 episodes talking about how that's not always the case. And yet, like, the inherent, like, assumption that is communicated in the way that we generally do business in research is cis normativity. The notion that binary assignment and that sort of congruence between your assignment and your gender identity, that is considered valid, whereas all others are just inherently invalidated. Now, it goes further, right? Because this isn't just about, and I've got to say, like, these guys, Lindquist and colleagues, they do some amazing work. They recommend a bunch of different things, but they fundamentally recommend that we can divide gender into several aspects. And they say there are kind of 4 main ones that they think research should focus on if they're interested in gender differences. They say that first they should ask about physiological and bodily aspects, how somebody's body is configured in relation to gendered anatomy. Then they should ask about gender identity or self-defined gender. Then they could ask about legal gender if they're interested. And then they could ask about social gender in terms of norm-related behaviors and gender expressions. Because, sometimes I get asked the question, do trans guys who present themselves as more feminine exist? And absolutely they do. Do trans girls who present themselves as more masculine exist? They absolutely do. Gender expression, how somebody expresses their gender, how they perform their gender to themselves and to the world, is separate from gender identity. How somebody identifies, how, what feels like home, that's what I am, right? Gender identity, gender expression are separate. So it is absolutely possible for somebody's social gender to be quite separate from their gender identity, and for that too to be separate from and different to their biological configuration, how the body is configured. So Lindquist and colleagues say, listen, we kind of need to, if you're interested in gender differences, you sort of need to know about all of those, right? And certainly we shouldn't get caught in the sort of cis normativity of thinking about gender as fundamentally male and female and just assuming that's the case. And, we'll not worry too much about people who fall outside of that norm, right? We've got to understand that's a norm. It's not necessarily the truth of people's experience. But this is, of course, a symptom of a societal issue, not like the whole issue, right? Research is saying, male and female are the only 2 genders, but, that's not just research, it's the whole of society. We've talked about this before, right? That, you go into any, basically any restaurant and you'll find that there is male toilets, there's female toilets, there might be accessible toilets, and there's no thought to the idea that there might be genders outside of those 2 experiences, right? Like that gender diverse folk, gender fluid folk or non-binary folk, they can use the accessible toilet, but otherwise, but just the presence of those toilets, that being the only ones that people have really thought about, just inherently privileges cisgender experiences and inherently undermines or invalidates non-cisgender experiences. And that's fundamentally the challenge. Yeah, ban me from X for using the word cisgender. Elon, I'm right here. Come and get me. Or even better yet, make a statement and we'll tackle it on the podcast for sure. Say, let's take a look at the history then, because I think granted we're in a position now where cis normativity has become kind of mainstream, right? But gender diverse experiences, as we've already discussed, are not new. So understanding the terminology and how we got to where we are, and trying to define trans and gender diversity and try and define gender identity, we need to understand the history, because the reason why, fundamentally what Lindquist's article kind of highlights, maybe not explicitly, but it does highlight it, that cisnormativity is the reason why we need terms like non-binary, why we need terms like trans and gender identity, is to describe to people, often to the cisgender community, what gender diverse experiences are, and to claim a space in the world, right? To create language that allows us to describe our own experiences to wider society and to claim validity, to claim a space in the world where we could all find a place to belong, right? We have to use this language. This language exists in order to stand against the sort of cisnormativity of society. But it has a history, and that history is really interesting. Now, Brooks did this amazing piece of work in 2000, Enigmatic Ensemble, Narrative Accounts of Gender Identity and Gender Expression from a Transgender Perspective. Now, this, I got to tell you, is maybe one of my favorite articles that I've read in a while. So I didn't write it, importantly. In Dissertation Abstracts International. So I don't know that this actually got published in a peer-reviewed journal, but it exists in the grey literature. It's a dissertation, or it's a doctoral thesis, I'm pretty sure. It's not just an undergrad dissertation. This is a doctoral thesis. And it is stunning. It's beautifully written. It is very descriptive and detailed, and it goes into a great deal of detail about history and ultimately carves out this beautiful space where they say, look, the problem is that this history is that it's non-gender diverse folk trying to describe the trans experience. And so what Brooks does is goes and interviews a load of trans folk. Now, bearing in mind, this was in 2000, right? This is 25 years ago nearly. And where they collected their data probably over 25 years ago. And so they were reaching out long before the majority of researchers were. They reached out right before anybody else was to ask people about their experiences and try and define gender identity using people's own experiences, allowing people to define it for themselves, which I think is gorgeous. I don't think this research got anywhere near the kind of praise it probably deserved at the time. And it's brilliant. And so the history here is I learned a lot from this article because I didn't know, for example, that Virginia Charles Prince, now Virginia Prince, Charles in inverted commas, Virginia Prince was a transgender activist, right? Long before the term transgender existed, right? And she was known as the matriarch of crossdressers. Now, supposedly she started to present as a girl gradually more and more, and ultimately started passing. And there was this big event where she went to a Halloween party and completely passed as a girl. And I think that sort of unlocked who she was on the inside. And it was her who coined the term transgenderist, right? Now, bearing in mind the ist has fallen by the wayside over time. And so transgender is a term that a transgender woman first coined. How absolutely beautiful is that? I had no idea that the word transgender came from a transgender person. They described themselves using that term for the first time. Nobody else had done it before. How amazing is that? What a beautiful thing to be able to look back on. So transgender activist Phyllis Randolph Fry has suggested that transgender is then therefore became an umbrella term that included kind of transsexualism and but basically the problem, of course, of the time was that we've kind of talked about this slightly briefly before, that gender non-conforming behaviors were also seen under the same kind of banner as transgender behaviors, because as transgender experiences, because a lot of the time people who were transgender were seen as cross-dressing rather than seen as trans, because people didn't understand what it was to be trans, and they didn't understand the distinction between gender expression and gender identity at the time. Really interesting. Aim Boleyn, who was an anthropologist at the time in 1994, went on to kind of crystallize the definition of transgenderist as a community term denoting kinship among those with gender variant identities. So this beautiful word transgenderist, which I just love, makes me sound like a magician, that transgender folk, like a transgender person, like created the term, and gradually it became increasingly umbrella to be able to cover all kinds of gender variant identities, which I think was stunning. Now, it was Hirschfeld then who took a slightly different approach and started to coined transvestite, the first person to coin transvestite, basically, by identifying a group of 17 people who cross-dressed, who were gender non-conforming as transvestites, people who, wore the clothing of the opposite gender. Now, of course, it all gets a bit pickly because opposite gender is a bit weird. We're not quite sure of the gender identity of these folk because nobody was really asking about their gender identity. They were more interested in their gender non-conforming behaviors and still saw them fundamentally as the gender they were assigned at birth. But Hirschfeld's work was obviously really important. It was some of the first earliest work around gender diverse communities from a properly scientific perspective. And I think we'd probably be a bit further than we are now scientifically had Hirschfeld's work not been kind of largely burned by the Nazis, right? Magnus Hirschfeld's clinic was one of the first, working with gender diverse folk, one of the first to be burned, and his research was some of the first to be burned by the Nazis in one of the biggest and most famous book burnings. So we lost a lot of the research that was important at the time, and a lot of that work obviously set us back because Magnus Hirschfeld was an important researcher of his time. Even to the extent, right, that Caldwell in 1949 is often quoted in the literature as the first author to use the word transsexual, but it looks like it was actually Hirschfeld in 1923 who first coined the term, not only transvestite, right, but transsexualism, transsexual. And he used it 25 years before Caldwell, but his work was largely destroyed. And I think that may well be the reason why Caldwell is erroneously cited as the first person to use the word transsexual. Now, transgender folk became the focus of research attention again in 1952. You see why, if Magnus Hirschfeld's work hadn't been interrupted, would we have been 25 years further along than we are, given that it took 25 years for the research to sort of really catch up? That was when Christine Jorgensen started the modern era of gender identity research, basically. She was the first person to become widely known in the States for receiving sexual reassignment surgery, right? Bottom surgery, essentially. And Benjamin in 1966, so much further on, right? Benjamin in 1966 published the first textbook to deal with transsexualism, in inverted commas, and popularized the term and described Christine Jorgensen's experience. And it was Harry Benjamin, for whom the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association is named. Benjamin was one of the people who performed the bottom surgery for Christine Jorgensen. They were both endocrinologists, him and Hamburger was the other surgeon, and they basically defined transsexual people as individuals who are trapped in the wrong body, in inverted commas, but don't have any delusion about their biological configuration, right? So that's the first definition that we ran into. This definition, 1966, defining the transsexual experience as people who are, in inverted commas, trapped in the wrong body, where there's something essential about them as people. Their gender on the inside is different to the way in which their body is configured and different to the way in which the world relates to them. So 1997, then it was Cole and colleagues who looked at the files of more than 435 transsexual patients. Apologies for use of language. I know transsexual is an old term, but it's obviously the term of the time. And they looked to understand, what is happening for this community, and do they have some kind of psychopathology that basically describes what's happening for them better than being trapped in the wrong body, in inverted commas. But what they actually found was that these people, right, the 435 transsexual patients that they looked at, in inverted commas, they had as normal psychological experience as the rest of the population. They were just as normal, in inverted commas, in psychological terms, the terms that they used, as the rest of the population. They said that direct quotation, transsexualism is usually an isolated diagnosis and not part of any psychopathological disorder. So some of the first people to identify that the trans community are not like pathological in any way psychologically, that this is a reality of people's experience. So we get to essentially 2000, right? The turn of the century, 2000, we start to understand that, you know, the trans community exists, that they aren't pathological psychologically, and that they, the best way of describing it at the time was that they were, in inverted commas, trapped in the wrong body. I know that's not a great definition to use today, but we'll come to that. Now, by the time we hit the turn of the millennium, right, 2000, there are a bunch of different theories as to what, like, transgender, gender diversity, what sort of gender identity could be, essentially. The first was psychoanalytic theory. Stoller was a big name in the field. And the theory basically went that, you know, especially kind of trans girls in the world got too close to mother and started to internalize something about femininity from them and developed abnormally, in inverted commas. Then there was socio-behavioral or socio-biological theory, viewing gender role and gender identity as fundamentally two sides of the same coin. And this is John Money's idea, right? That gender role is like the externalization or the sort of the outside expression of gender identity, and gender identity is the internalization of gender role. Now, seeing them as essentially the same thing, but one as being visible and one as being internal is a problem, right? Because what that implies is a little bit like social constructionism, that it implies that essentially what you can do is if you raise a child with a particular gender role, then their gender identity as the other side of that coin will change as well. And of course, we already talked about like David Raymer and the challenges that he experienced at the hands of John Money, who tried to raise this little chap as a girl in order to kind of prove the theory, and ended up being wrong. Essentially, this little chap didn't ever identify as a girl and ultimately lived their life as a boy, learning only in adolescence about his gender history. It was an interesting quote, actually, Milton Diamond putting holes in this theory. This is a direct quote from Milton Diamond's work. Joan, the clinical team involved in her, in inverted commas, management, and then the family discussed Joan's, in inverted commas, desire to live as the male she felt she was. When she switched to living as John, learning the truth of his history basically came as a welcome relief, as it essentially confirmed what he had believed all along. He immediately and happily recast his life. That's Milton Diamond describing David Raymer. Fascinating stuff, right? They had essentially created a transgender child by trying to raise a child as a gender different to the one that they identified as. Then we have the social constructionist position, which is a sort of connected to gender schema theory from Bem. It's really interesting, this idea. Bohan describes the common misunderstanding that social construction theory of gender means that gender-typed attributes are simply the result of socialization, but they describe the idea that social construction is not necessarily a trait of the individual, but rather a process external to the individual, and that gender is defined by interactions between people, by language, and by the discourse of culture. So social construction theory kind of says that gender is a complex interplay of identities and expressions that are constructed through dialogue and between people and using language and in discourse and culturally and in interactions within a culture. And then cultural feminist theory from Chodorow. Nancy Chodorow talks about a developmental constructivist model which regards gender difference as an artifact of cultural inequality. So it sort of goes one step further and says that the cultural inequalities start and then our gender construction follows on. Like men and women are a category that we use to describe difference because there is a gender inequality in the society, in the culture, we create the cultural inequality between the two groups and then name the two groups as saliently different to one another in order to try and validate this cultural inequality that was otherwise invalid, clearly. And then it goes on to the postmodern paradigm and onward and onward. But the author amazingly kind of says, listen, the problem with all of this, like Brooks says, the problem with all of this is that it's all essentially non-gender diverse folk trying to understand the lives of gender diverse folk. And she says, listen, the first thing we need to do is to ask gender diverse folk. So 25 years ago, right, the author went and asked gender diverse folk, how do you see gender? And this is what they said. Direct quotation. I see myself as having certain qualities of both genders. Not necessarily the good qualities, not necessarily the bad qualities of either one. As my life has gone on, I've realized that I'm more towards the feminine side of my personality than the masculine side. Mimi is very much more a part of me than is not. I feel more in drag as my male persona than in my female persona. In the beginning, I needed the clothing, the makeup, the hair, all of that to feel like Mimi, but now I feel like Mimi regardless of what I'm wearing. Another quote. Transgenderism is a new term. It was a new term in 2000. Transgenderism is a new term. It always used to be transsexual. I felt that way since I was 4 years old, and Mayo Clinic confirmed my thoughts in 1970. In those days, you couldn't talk about this thing because when I was 4 years old, it was 1928. Transgender, transsexuals, not even heard of. The only thing you ever heard of was somebody was queer if they were homosexual. Queer was the term used then. I was blessed with the ability to walk in both shoes, to see life in a perspective that most don't get to. And because of that, when I look at life, I don't see it in 2 dimensions. I see 3 dimensions, both male and female, and I make decisions that way. One thing that has been remarkable since I integrated myself into the person, not male or female, but I think of it from my standpoint that is both masculine and feminine. It doesn't mean that I'm better than or that I have a grand insight. I just look at things from that perspective. Another direct quote. To call myself transgender means, amongst other things, that I know few boundaries in my sexual preference and who I'm attracted to, that my own personal feelings of my masculinity fluctuate, my own personal conceptions of my gender fluctuate between a masculine polarity and a feminine polarity, and it's usually a mix in between that I see myself fluctuating on a continuum frequently and in all my actions. Transgender to me suggests that one does not identify with a rigid gender, but is able to be nebulous and amorphous in their gender, in how they identify with their gender. I consider myself bisexual, but also in a social setting, I consider myself as being fluid, being the masculine and feminine in society, and I behave my identity as a mixture of the two. Fluid means that it's always changing and in flux, nebulous and amorphous. It changes in different situations. It's a constant of change. The last quote. It's a continuum, and everybody, males and females, fall somewhere on this continuum, the gender continuum. And running from the transsexual post-op to the guy who puts on his wife's pantyhose one night, somewhere everybody falls in there, no matter how macho or machismo he may be, because I'm only going to address the male side of it. He'll fall in there. He is on there somewhere. It's kind of gorgeous, right? Like 25 years ago, so early when we barely understood, right? The concept, the term transgender was only freaking coined in like 1976. This is 25 years after the first coining of the transgender. And these folk are talking about their experiences and defining gender as fluid, as fluctuating, as very deeply personal, and as, as something inherent to them in such a deep and profound way. So we covered the sort of the definitions of trans and like how the definitions of like gender identity and transgender experiences evolved over time. And what's really cool is that this also happened for genders beyond the binary. Now, what is we got a really cool study. Thorne and colleagues, 2019, the terminology of identities between, outside, and beyond the gender binary, a systematic review. Our own Jamie Wilson conducted a systematic review not wildly dissimilar to this. Also a really good place to go. But I'm kind of loath a little bit to promote our own work too heavily here, because I think it could elicit accusations of bias quite easily. Maybe one day we'll cover all the research that we're doing. Get in the comments if you want to hear about that. But Thorne and colleagues, 2019, really interesting. So they look at things like the history. This is the first place they go to. And they found that Greek god Hermaphroditus was like, and the Sumeria Gala priests of ancient Mesopotamian cities all represented individuals who were not easily identified as male or female. Philosophers also highlight that some early Christian leaders actively promoted androgyny as the original and maybe ideal state of people. And of course, in pre-Columbus America, there are many historical reports of many tribes holding the belief that there were, in fact, many more than just two genders. Lots of two-spirit experiences. Very difficult for us to kind of look to those sans the sort of cultural lens that is inherently colonial. Very difficult to do. And it was, of course, the advent of Christianity that saw many cultures invited to adhere to the strict male and female binary imposed upon them by religion. But they also highlight that there are many periods in history, 1920s, 1960s, and the current day, where androgyny was in vogue, was in fashion, where, genders outside of the binary are seen as, not only valid, but even desirable. Now, they brought together 39 studies. They did a systematic review. Gotta love a systematic review. They brought together 39 studies looking at non-binary experiences outside, like any gender experiences outside of the binary. And they were interested in the ways in which language had constructed over time. Definitions had sort of evolved over time. And they highlight that it started with psychological androgyny, this notion that that there are some people who are androgynous in the way that they experience themselves. Androgynous, of course, is still kind of seen as maybe a bit like in the middle of male and female. And that then over time got replaced by pomosexuality, which is a kind of postmodern sexuality. And then that moved on to genderqueer, and then non-binary, and then GQ/NB or NBGQ, this kind of non-binary genderqueer experience that found its way into the modern literature. But the authors say that we are still, they say, still very early, right? So while we've got this kind of trans and gender diverse umbrella, which catches kind of lots of gender diverse experiences, and we have like a transgender experience as understood a bit more discreetly, and we understand some of the kind of gender diverse experiences under that moniker more discreetly. Our non-binary understanding, our understanding of non-binary experiences and the language used to describe those experiences is still quite early. And the reason is because non-binary as a term is one that either implies that people are in the middle of male and female, where that definition is often not the case. But it also denotes it also refers to the binary, right? The authors kind of say, listen, this refers to a gender binary, and these are folk whose gender inherently is something other than the binary. And to use the binary as a reference point for it is inherently paradoxical, right? It's problematic. It implies that it validates a binary model of gender inherently in the language, which then, the non-binary communities have to separate themselves out from. It's necessary in some way because, of course, when we're talking about like the cis-normativity of environments, gender diverse folk often get caught around that. That's the reason we need language. Of course, that's the reason why the non-binary language has been generated, why it exists, is in order to kind of highlight to people that the binary experiences are not the only experiences that are valid in the world, and to separate people's experiences out as different to binary experiences. Now, in their work, Thorne and colleagues kind of say they think that where we're headed, I think, they highlight that gender diverse as a term is it might be the way in which we step forward here, because, if we were to, we need a term that highlights people and people's experience, that captures us all, and that doesn't refer to the binary at all. It doesn't inherently validate the binary or establish that the binary is somehow the norm that we're separating from, right? And so gender diverse is potentially a term that can do that. Now, Hines writes, a gender diverse person does not conform to the society's norms or values when it comes to their gendered physicality, gendered identity, or gender expression, or combination of those factors. The definition, say our Thorne and colleagues, the definition suggests that diversity relates to those with identities beyond those of binary gender markers, suggesting all gender identities beyond the recognizable identities of male and female could fall under the gender diverse umbrella. So the theory is that while research and language on the sort of transgender community moved quicker than for the non-binary communities, actually maybe the distinction between these two places isn't as significant or as substantial as it appears. That actually, when we look to the trans community, we even ask, 25 years ago, asking people to describe their own experiences, there's a lot of non-binary kind of fluid, amorphous, like evolving experiences. And maybe our temptation to see transgender people as binary is itself problematic, and maybe a sort of legacy of the gender binary that is imposed upon all of us. And so what these authors are kind of saying, and what looks like the research is kind of saying overall, is that as genderqueer, non-binary experiences become like something that we understand better, maybe we start to recognize that gender may just not be particularly helpfully described as binary at all, and that the term gender diverse, in absence of that, the term gender diverse might give us an opportunity to recognize and celebrate that all people express a gender identity, and that gender identity and expressions are not necessarily linked to a person's sex. That's from Winter. So, right, like gender diversity might become the umbrella term that captures us all, the place in which we can all find a place to belong, right? So now we kind of have a language to describe gender diverse experiences, right? The question still remains, what do people think gender means, right? Has this kind of evolved language and understanding of gender diverse experiences impacted the way in which people now see gender? What does gender mean to people now? Hall and colleagues, 2021, they published a paper called Deep Questions for a Saturday Morning. I freaking love good titles. An investigation of the Australian and Canadian general public's definitions of gender in Social Science Quarterly. This is a cool paper. They basically brought together 405 members of the general public from two cities, one in Australia, that's 195 people, and one in Canada, 210 people. And they basically asked people, what is your gender? And invited people to like respond in their own words. And then they basically then asked them, what is gender? They literally just, that's what they asked. They said, what is gender? And then they coded the responses, the free text responses. And there were a bunch of different responses around, from multiple different responses to social construction was in there, to something that was less clear, to biology, to male stroke female, to feelings stroke identification. And so there were a range of different views in the general public about what gender really was. So here's what I found most interesting. They found that most people, the people who, like the answer they got most frequently was feelings stroke identification. And that was the case for like girls in the study, the case for guys in the study, the case for non-binary folk in the study. Feelings and identification was the most common response they got. The second most common response was male stroke female. But interestingly, they found that the age group that people belonged to did have an impact. So people who were lower, like below the age of 40, 18 to 39, they most frequently highlighted feeling stroke identification as the most frequent response to the question of what is gender. But people aged 40 and above answered male and female as the most common response. So what we find is, going back to Lindquist's work, is that we really cannot afford to continue to use just male and female, like which gender are you, male and female? Because not only does that create like a cis normativity or reinforce cis normativity, which creates problems for gender diverse communities, but as Hall and colleagues here find, people don't agree on what gender is, right? Like they just don't agree when it comes to like fundamentally, is it about feelings or identification? Is it referring to some kind of biologically essentialist characteristic? Is it just male and female? People don't agree. But most people now do cite that feelings and identification are the most important thing, or at least they're the thing they think of when they think about what is gender. Now, to try and answer the question of what is trans, Buck and colleagues in 2016 wrote an article called Defining Transgender. What do lay definitions say about prejudice? And they did a cool piece of work. So they had a final sample of 200 participants. They excluded all the LGBT participants that they had. A largely female sample, about 80% female, 80% white, 7.5% black, 5% Hispanic, 3.5% bi or multiracial, 1.5% Asian or Pacific Islander, 1% Native American, and 1% Middle Eastern. All participants between the ages of 18 and 22, mean age of just shy of 19 years. And they asked people to answer the question, what does the word transgender mean? Which I absolutely love these studies. Like, yeah, what is gender? Just answer the question, what is gender? What is transgender? What does the word transgender mean? Now, here's what's interesting. They, again, got quite different responses. They got people talking about gender expression, how people express their gender. An example, a person who dresses in the opposite fashion of their birth gender. They got change being one of the things that people talked about. Someone who changes their gender to be the opposite of their natural born gender, in inverted commas, is one of the quotes from people who use that kind of definition. And they had people, the majority of people, about 60% of participants, 59% of participants cited gender identity, identifying with a different gender or sex than the one assigned at birth. And what was the big factor that highlight what people used? They basically also asked about anti-transgender attitudes and endorsement of traditional gender roles. And they found that participants with more positive attitudes towards transgender people were more likely to acknowledge gender identity as a defining feature of the term transgender. So this is where we have got to, this beautiful place where gender diversity is the term that we can use to sort of cover all of the folk who find themselves in unusual places on the gender spectrum. The evolving terms around non-binary and genderqueer identities and gender fluid identities are evolving and, need a lot of work. But gender diverse covers us all to some extent. And our understandings as a consequence, potentially, or at least alongside that, are sort of popular understandings of what gender is and indeed of what transgender is. What is trans? Well, it turns out that people understand in the main that gender identity is what being trans is about. It's about how we identify on the inside. And while some people talk about change and some people talk about gender expression, the majority of people describe gender identity. Now, the challenge, of course, which we're going to run into is the question of how do we define gender identity itself? And that's really difficult because I think it's very individual, unique to the person, right? Because people's experience of their own gender identity, how they feel about themselves on the inside in terms of gender is going to be to some extent shaped by culture and language. It's going to be to some extent shaped by their own individual experience. And probably more than anything, it's going to be a journey of discovery as they understand how they feel on the inside and the extent to which that is congruent or dissonant with their assignment. Gender identity is something we often only know about because people experience incongruence. Now, there are a couple of definitions, though, that I really like. The first is from Hines. A gender identity is each person's internal sense of being male, female, a combination of the two, or neither. It is a core part of who people know themselves to be. But I like this one better, and we've talked about it before, and I don't know who came up with it. I used every tool in my arsenal to find the originator of this quote. If you find them, come find me. It's always possible that I wrote it and forgot that I wrote it. That's entirely possible, but that's risky because it could easily be somebody else's quote, and I don't want to claim that I wrote it if it is someone else's. So I think this is someone else's quote. Gender identity. The only thing that's consistent across all individuals with a given gender identity, such as man or woman, amongst others, is the deep-seated sense of identification with the concept. The term rings true. It holds meaning. Something inside of us says, yes, that's right, that makes sense, that feels like home, that's what I am. That feels like home, that's what I am. That's why it's mediated by language and culture, right? Because what feels like home, what you are, depends on the options available to you in your language and in cultural understanding and in the models in your environment, in how you understand yourself to be in that context. But I really like this one from Feinberg in 1998, slightly paraphrasing, but it's kind of brilliant, right? Because while we try to define gender identity, Feinberg is Feinberg says, as gender diverse people, don't have to explain why we are the way we are. We have to explain who we are, how we see ourselves. While there is, as yet, no language for who I have become, I articulate my gender, silent to the ear, but thunderous to the eye. Thanks very much for joining me. I really like this idea that we don't need to define ourselves, we just need to tell our stories, and in so doing, carve out a world where everyone can find a place to belong. Thanks so very much for joining me. This is Classroom Psychology. You are extremely welcome here. Hey, if you really like this podcast, get out there and leave us a comment. Please don't hesitate. Give us a rating on your favorite podcast app. Share it with someone you love. And I look forward to seeing you, as always, in the next one.